Now, to begin with, let me give you a little bit of background as to how I became interested and involved in this subject. Now, when I briefly lived in Perth in 1990, a friend of the guy I was staying with came to visit one evening for dinner. Now, he was an older gentleman by the name of Bill who currently attends the United Church of God over in Perth. I think he's currently in his 80s. Now, during our dinner conversation, he shared some fascinating information about ancient catastrophes in biblical times. And when I asked him more about it, he'd lent me a book called Worlds in Collision by a Russian-born Jew named MManuel VELIKOVSKY, who happened to be a close personal friend of Albert Einstein. Now, the book covered the period from the Exodus through to the time of Hezekiah, and it espoused the radical idea that close passes of heavenly bodies were used to cause various catastrophes during this time, beginning with the plagues at the time of the Exodus. Now, regardless of the accuracy of such claims, I found the ancient source evidence he used absolutely fascinating. Now, Velikovsky in his writings explained how the book came to be written. Now, during his research, he came upon a document called the Ipuwer Papyrus, dated to the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, which describes plagues eerily similar to what is found in the Bible about the plagues of Egypt. In researching ancient testimonies of other people around the world at the same time, he came to the radical conclusion that the plagues of Egypt were not just localized to Egypt, but affected the whole world. And based on those worldwide ancient testimonies, he wrote Worlds in Collision, which was a bestseller when originally published in 1950. Now, he then turned his attention to the chronological implications of his claim that the Ipuwer Papyrus was indeed an Egyptian record of the plagues of Egypt. Now, the document is generally believed to have been written in the 13th dynasty at the end of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. Now, based on the conventional chronology that is today used by Egyptologists, this document was dated to about 300 years before the biblical date of the Exodus, around 1450 BC. Now, Velikovsky also found another extraordinary piece of ancient testimony. This time it was a whole wall in the Temple of Karnak, which, according to his forensic study, included items which were a very close match to those items taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He concluded that the 18th dynasty pharaoh Thutmose III, who commissioned this relief in the Temple of Karnak and had expanded the Egyptian empire all the way to the Euphrates, was the pharaoh the Bible refers to by the name of Shishak, who plundered the temple in the days of King Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Now, a third piece of ancient evidence that Velikovsky used in his reconstruction of ancient history were the AMARNA letters. Now, you may be familiar with the heretical late 18th dynasty pharaoh Akhenaten, who was the father of the famous boy king Tutankhamun. Now, as part of his religious reforms, he created a new city called Akhenaten, which was abandoned soon after his reign. Now, at that site, which is today called El Amarna, a huge cache of foreign correspondence was found between Egypt and the local rulers in Palestine and Syria, who were under the hegemony of Egypt at this period of time. Now, the conventional chronology used by Egyptologists dates Akhenaten's reign to the time of the judges in Israel during the 1300s BC. Velikovsky, based on the details in the letters, made a case that the letters were written during the Middle Kingdom, or the middle of the kingdom period in Israel, around the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, nearly 500 years later. Now, based on those three key pieces of evidence and others, he wrote a book called Ages and Chaos, which covered the period from the Exodus to the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, synchronizing the histories of Egypt and Israel, in which he claimed that the conventional chronology was out of sync by some 500 years for the time of the 18th dynasty. Now, three later books would cover the rest of his historical reconstruction up to the time of Alexander the Great's conquest. Now, after I read Worlds in Collision, I was hungry for more and And of course I found Ages in Chaos and the other books in his Ages in Chaos series. And with the advent of the internet in the mid-1990s, I eagerly searched for other material relating to what he'd written. Now I found certain journals were published by his followers, and that some of the contributors to these journals had taken his research in other directions. Now, one of those contributors to the SIS journal was David Rohl, who wrote his book A Test of Time, first published in 1995. Now, David is a likeable guy and a really great communicator on this subject, and he's contributed some wonderful new evidence supporting the need to revise the conventional chronology of Egypt. Now, one of his biggest contributions is making the connection between the site of Avaris, excavated by Manfred Betak, with the Goshen of the Bible. Another of his great contributions is his reconstruction of the archaeology in Israel based on a conquest at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, while he accepts VELIKOVSKY'S synchronism of the fall of the Middle Kingdom at the time of the Exodus, based on the Epic of Papyrus, he did not accept VELIKOVSKY'S synchronism of Shishak with Thutmose III. Instead, he believes that Ramses the Great of the next dynasty, the 19th dynasty, was instead Shishak, based on a rather brief record in the Ramesseum that Ramses the Great had indeed been to Jerusalem. Now, before we move on to the next slide here, notice how brief a period that David gives to the 20th dynasty. Now, as far as their dynasty placements goes, this is the one main difference between his and the next revised chronology that I came across. Now, another SIS journal contributor whose work I came across was Peter James. Now, he had collaborated with David Rohl with a reconstruction of the third intermediate period, dynasties 21 to 25, that for the most part matches up quite well with VELIKOVSKY'S placements of these same dynasties. Now, VELIKOVSKY claimed that the conventional dates for the 18th dynasty need to be brought forward by 500 years. Now, David Rohl took a more conservative approach, and he argued that the conventional dates for the 18th dynasty needed to only be brought forward by only 350 years. Peter James took an even more conservative position, arguing that they only need to be brought forward by 250 years. Now, in his book Centuries of Darkness, Peter James has lots of evidence about the Dark Age of Greece and Turkey, which he says was artificially created by the artificially lengthened Egyptian chronology. Now, ironically, much of that evidence shows that the Dark Age outside of Egypt is over twice the length that Peter James argues that the conventional dates for the 18th dynasty need to be brought forward by. Now, around the same time that I bought those books by David Rohl and Peter James, I ran across this magazine called Archaeological Diggings. Its editor is David Down, a Seventh-day Adventist from Sydney. Now, he's also done a great video series called Digging Up the Past, and co-written a more recent and beautifully illustrated book called Unwrapping the Pharaohs that I highly recommend for newcomers to this subject. Now, his reconstruction is based on the work of Donovan Courville, another Seventh-day Adventist scholar, who wrote a 2-volume series called The Exodus Problem and Its Ramifications. Now, his reconstruction accepts both of VELIKOVSKY'S synchronisms of the Exodus with the end of the Middle Kingdom and Shishak with Thutmose III. Now, following the end of the 18th dynasty, which both he and VELIKOVSKY date to around 820 BC, he fits all of dynasties 19 to 25 into the brief period between 820 and 660 BC. He has the other New Kingdom dynasties, 19 and 20, ruling at the same time as the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties from 21 to 25. Now, it's this terrible squeeze of dynasties into such a short period of time that has led to scholars such as David Rohl, Peter James and John Bimson to find a less radical squeeze of dynasties. Now, John Bimson, who you may remember from the fantastic new documentary Patterns of Evidence, wrote an article arguing against VELIKOVSKY'S major synchronism of the Wall of Thutmose III being the items of the temple raided by Shishak, as a means of breaking free of the constraints of squeezing so many dynasties into such a short period of time. Immanuel Velikovsky had a more radical solution to deal with this squeeze of dynasties problem. Now, Velikovsky absolutely shocked his followers with the next books in his Ages and Chaos series before his death in 1979. In Rameses II and his time, he argued that the conventional order of dynasties handed down to us from Manetho, who lived in the 3rd century BC, was not a true chronological order. He argued that after the 18th dynasty fell, soon after King Tutankhamun around 820 BC, that the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties, dynasties 22 to 25, then ruled. And then came that other famous dynasty, the 19th dynasty of Rameses the Great. So he separated dynasties 18 and 19 by 150 years, and those foreign dynasties. He argued that Rameses the Great ruled not at the time of the Exodus, as seen in the movie The Ten Commandments, but was the pharaoh at the time of the Jewish exile to Babylon. Now, he claimed that Rameses the Great was the pharaoh called Necho in the Bible, who fought the famous Battle of Carchemish against Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the last of Judah's good kings, Josiah, if you remember from the Bible, blocked Necho's path on his way up to Syria, and Josiah was shot by an arrow and died at that time. Now, this Necho is conventionally believed to be Necho II of the 26th dynasty. Now, Velikovsky claimed that Necho II was the alter ego of Rameses the Great of the 19th dynasty. Now, Velikovsky claimed that not only were dynasties 18 and 19 separated by 150 years, but that dynasties 19 and 20 were also separated in time, and that Rameses III of dynasty 20 ruled just after 400 BC, late in Egypt's history, when it had a few decades of independence during the time of the Persian Empire, and that dynasty 21 was close to that same time. Now, a major event where Egypt's and Israel's histories intersect is where Pharaoh Shishak plundered the temple in Jerusalem in the days of Solomon's son Rehoboam. Now, a major synchronism with the Bible was established by Champollion, the Frenchman who deciphered the Rosetta Stone. Now, on the outside of the Temple of Karnak in Thebes is a relief of Palestinian cities paying tribute to the 22nd dynasty king Shoshenq I, who was from one of the Libyan dynasties of the period of foreign rule in Egypt, known as the Third Intermediate Period. Now, Champollion, in his excitement, saw the similarity of the name Shoshenq I with the pharaoh called Shishak in the Bible, who plundered the temple around 923 BC, soon after Solomon died. And that synchronism, based purely on a similarity of name, has stuck ever since. Now, upon closer examination, the cities paying tribute are only from northern Israel, not from Judah, which is the reverse of the account of Shishak's conquest in the Bible, as it was Judah, not Israel, that was conquered. Now, this great pillar of Egyptian chronology, which is still maintained to this day, is theoretically confirmed by the close match of adding the reigns recorded by Manetho back from the 25th dynasty, 700 BC, to Shoshenq I of the 22nd dynasty, who they have as ruling around 920 BC. Now, working back the same way using regnal dates of kings, the Exodus is placed during the 18th dynasty, which we have seen is the wrong place in Egyptians' history for the Exodus. Now, most revisionist chronologies support the placement of the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom during the 13th dynasty. Now, who they assign as the biblical Shishak will vary depending on the length of time that they assign to the Hyksos period. Now, the longer the period they assign the Hyksos, the earlier in Egypt's history will be their candidate for Shishak, who plundered the temple in Jerusalem about 520 years later. The shorter period they assign to the Hyksos, the later in Egypt's history will be their candidate for Shishak. Now, the closest revisionist chronology to the conventional chronology is Peter James's chronology. He's got the New Kingdom starting in about 1300 BC, which is 250 years after the conventional date. Now, like David Rohl, he compresses the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties, that's dynasties 21 to 25, down to around 160 years to fit in between the New Kingdom dynasties, that's dynasties 18 to 20, and the late period, starting from dynasty 26. Now, by starting dynasty 18 around 1300 BC, Peter James feels that Rameses III of the 20th dynasty was the biblical Shishak. Now, David Rohl has a similar chronology to Peter James's. He ends the New Kingdom, dynasty 20, about the same point as Peter James does, but he fits the New Kingdom into a shorter time frame by compressing dynasty 20 an extra 100 years. Now, he starts dynasty 18 around 1200 BC, about 100 years later than Peter James, which leaves only 250 years for the Hyksos. Now, by starting dynasty 18 around 1200 BC, David Rohl believes that Rameses II, that is Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty, was the biblical Shishak. Now, the next revisionist chronology that is further from the conventional Egyptian chronology is that of Immanuel VELIKOVSKY. Now, VELIKOVSKY advocates a period of just over 400 years for the Hyksos. Now, Josephus assigns 511 years for how long the Hyksos kings ruled, and VELIKOVSKY believes that there is some overlap of Hyksos kings which allows some compression of that time of the Hyksos period. Now, by starting dynasty 18 around 1025 BC, Immanuel VELIKOVSKY believes that Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty was the biblical Shishak. Now, an even more reduced chronology is put forth by Eric Atchison, who contends that the Hyksos period was the full 511 years stated by Josephus, over 100 years longer than VELIKOVSKY's 400 years. So, in his chronology, by starting dynasty 18 around 920 BC, Eric Atchison believes that the last Hyksos ruler, Apop II, was the biblical Shishak. So this graphic here shows you the various candidates put forth by those with revised chronologies, showing how they alter depending on the length each person assigns to the Hyksos period, and how each deals with the squeeze of dynasties problems that I've touched on earlier. Now, this graphic vividly portrays how little room there is to maneuver to fit in the remaining dynasties, starting from dynasty 18 to where dynasty 25 begins just before 700 BC. David Rohl likens this to the problem of untangling the Gordian knot. Now, Egypt's and Israel's histories intersect in the days of Solomon's son Rehoboam, when Pharaoh Shishak plunders the temple in Jerusalem. So, identify the best candidate for Shishak, and we can find out which dynasty was ruling about 923 BC. So let's now take a look at the evidence for each of their Shishak candidates. Now, Peter James says that Shishak is likely to have been Rameses III of the 20th dynasty, who's shown here saying, "Talk to the hand." Now, what is cool in this picture of him is that you can actually see the strap for holding up the long false beard that pharaohs often wore along with their Neme's headpiece. Now, Peter James equates Shishak with Rameses III on the basis of finding the pharaoh who best fits the general time frame and the biblical date of around 923 BC, based on where he places the dynasties prior to 700 BC. Now, Peter James does not use any synchronisms with other histories outside of Egypt to make a case for Rameses III. Now, Peter James states that the biblical name Shishak could well be a corruption of the Egyptian Sesi, the common abbreviation of the name Ramses. Now, it's quite possible that this is the derivation of the name Shishak. Now, what should be noted about this point, though, is that it can apply to any king with the name Ramses or Thutmoses, as it is derived from the end part of those names. Now, Peter James's logic in drawing his conclusion appears sound, but there is some evidence that seriously challenges it. Now, a damaging point against his identification is found at Ramses III's palace, found at Tel El Yehuda. Now, on tiles at the palace that have the pharaoh's hieroglyphic name on, there are Greek letters on the back of them. Now, no traces of the Greek language have been found to date before 750 BC. Not only that, these letters do not look like the early Greek letters of the 7th century BC, but they look like classical letters of the time of Plato in the 4th century BC. Now, according to Emil Bruch, the peculiar form used of the letter alpha seen on the tiles was not introduced until the 4th century BC. Now, Shishak plundered Jerusalem and its temple around 923 BC. The Greek tiles give an upper limit of 750 BC to the time of Rameses III, some 200 years after the biblical Shishak, though he may have reigned much later than even that date. Now let's look at David ROHL'S contender for Shishak. Now he claims that Rameses the Great of the 19th dynasty was Shishak based on a brief record in the Ramesseum that Rameses the Great had indeed been to Jerusalem. In A Test of Time he writes about this record. The town which the king plundered in year 8. Then followed the name of the city. At this point the inscription was a little more worn than the upper section, but I could still make out the hieroglyphic signs. SHALM. Visiting the site for myself had confirmed the research I had already completed in the library of the Egypt Exploration Society in London. The town which Rameses II had plundered, and which appears to be one of the high points of his year 8 campaign into Palestine, was called Shalem, the earliest known name for the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, a campaign of Rameses II into Palestine is graphically illustrated at the famous temple of Abu Simbel, which was relocated when the Aswan High Dam was built. Now, David writes about the following about this famous relief of Rameses the Great in this particular temple. He writes, "This is a campaign into a mountainous part of Palestine. The city atop a hill is the culmination of that campaign. The city surrenders without a fight. Could this be a graphical representation of the capture and subjugation of Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam? Is the steep slope below the ramparts the eastern escarpment of the city of David falling away into the Kidron Valley? Might the bearded man offering the incense burner be King Rehoboam himself? And could the high-ranking woman at the gates of the city be Solomon's now-aged widow, Pharaoh's daughter?" The year 8 campaign of Rameses into Palestine was initiated to put down a revolt which appears to have been inspired by the Egyptian losses in Syria 3 years earlier. Now, there's some reasonable evidence here to support David ROHL'S identification of Rameses II with Shishak, but there's also some compelling evidence arguing against this identification. Alan Montgomery makes the following comments arguing that David ROHL'S placement of Rameses II in the late 10th century BC is a geopolitical mismatch with what was happening in Asia at this time. Alan writes, "Rameses the Great's father, Seti I, invades Bethshan and sets up a stela in Bethshan in the northern area of Israel, in the middle of Israel's most powerful times during the reign of Solomon. While Solomon has everyone building the temple and his palace, an Egyptian army supposedly invades and establishes a military post in the middle of Israel, which is still there in the days of Rameses II. And what is the response of King Solomon, the richest and most powerful king of that world at that time, to this insufferable arrogance? We are expected then to believe that Solomon gave neither diplomatic nor military response to this. This is incredible. It never happened." There is substantive evidence that Rameses II controlled Israel and even took Jerusalem. However, Rameses II also made a treaty with the Hittites, Hattusilus III. Now, ROHL must place Hattusilus III in the same place as he places Rameses II in the 10th century with King Solomon and his son Rehoboam. Unfortunately, the 10th century in Assyrian history was a time of great weakness for Assyria. They could not barely defend their homeland. Thus, they could not at this time be a threat to attack or take Carchemish, as stated in the annals of Merciless II, Hattusilus III's father. No Assyrian king took Carchemish until Sargon II in the 8th century. Thus, Where the Egyptian evidence may look good, the proposal fails when evidence outside of Egypt is taken into account. Furthermore, Rameses II as Shishak poses another similar problem. The Hittites themselves are not in evidence during the reign of Solomon in the Bible. According to ROHL, this would be during the reign of Seti I. Seti sets up his stela and establishes a military base at Bethshan in order to defend Egypt against the Hittite menace. But are the Hittites a menace? Solomon mentions the Hittites only as a distant trading partners. They are not an imperial threat. Now, another point that appears to argue against Rameses II of the 19th dynasty being the Shishak of the Bible is the utter absence of any mention of Egypt in the book of Judges, despite mentioning many other lesser nations. If David ROHL'S chronology is correct, the mighty 18th dynasty would have ruled at the same time as the late Judges period, and we know from Egyptian records such as Thutmose III's record of Palestinian cities at Karnak and Thutmose IV's Berlin pedestal that its pharaohs made many expeditions into Palestine. If this was when the 18th dynasty ruled, why then is there no record in the book of Judges for this period that David ROHL claims that they ruled, especially given Thutmose IV's explicit mention of him subduing the nation of Israel? Now let's look at another candidate for Shishak. Now Eric Atchison argues that the last king of the Hyksos, Agag II, was Shishak. Now he accepts Josephus' figure of 511 years for the time of the Hyksos in Egypt, which compels this identification, as opposed to VELIKOVSKY'S view that there is some overlap in that figure. Now Eric has no specific evidence to support his identification of Agag II, such as any campaigns by him into Palestine. Now there is one major objection against this identification. The Hyksos, who based on Josephus' testimony are to be identified with the Amalekites, were, according to Eric's chronology, ruling during the days of Solomon. Solomon made an alliance with Egypt and married an Egyptian princess to seal this alliance. Would Solomon have made such an alliance with Israel's arch-enemies, the Amalekites? Well, personally, I think not. Now, this is still a problem, even if Eric chooses the next king, Ahmose I of the 18th dynasty, as Shishak. Now, let's now look at VELIKOVSKY'S candidate, Thutmose III of the mid-18th dynasty. Now, the Shishak first inscription is found on an outer wall of the temple of Karnak in Luxor, or Thebes, as it was anciently called. Now, inside this very same temple in Karnak is another relief from a pharaoh of the middle of the 18th dynasty that makes a far better case for being the Shishak of the Bible. Now, there is a much larger bas-relief of Thutmose III offering a huge cache of objects to the god Amun. Now, in Ages and Chaos, VELIKOVSKY writes, The treasures brought by Thutmose III from Palestine are reproduced on a wall of the Karnak temple. The bas-reliefs display in 10 rows the legendary wealth of King Solomon. There are pictures of various precious objects, furnishings, vessels and utensils of the temple, of the palace, probably also of the shrines of foreign deities. Under each object, a numerical symbol indicates how many of that kind were brought by the Egyptian king from Palestine. Each stroke meant 1 piece. Each arch meant 10 pieces. Each spiral 100 pieces of the same thing. If Thutmose III had wanted to boast and display all his spoils from the temple and the palace of Jerusalem by showing each object separately, instead of using this number system, a wall a mile long would have been required, and even that would have not sufficed. Now, in the upper 5 rows, the objects of gold are presented. In the next rows, silver things are mingled with those of gold and precious stones. Objects of bronze and semi-precious stones are in the lower rows. Now, gods were often depicted in Egyptian temples in shameless positions. Among the figures of sacred objects on the Karnak bas-relief, there are none of phallic form, neither are there any pictures of gods at all. A few animal heads, lions with the sign of the uraeus on their forehead, and the head of an orc are wrought on the lids of some cups. These cups might have been brought from the palace Solomon had built for his wife. Now the bas-relief here displays what appears to be the legendary wealth of Solomon's age, including vessels and utensils of the temple, the golden altar, the brazen altar, the showbread, gold and silver, and the candlesticks. Now some examples of the temple booty on this relief include an exact match of 100 basins of gold and 300 shields to what was in the temple according to the Bible. And this argues very strongly in favour of the items being one and the same as the treasure taken by Shishak from the temple in Jerusalem. Now in Ages and Chaos, Velikovsky does an excellent forensic analysis comparing what is in the Bible regarding the treasures of the temple and the relief here of Thutmose III, and they do make a remarkable match. Now personally I consider it to be the mother of all synchronisms, yet this synchronism has been rejected by such eminent revisionist scholars such as John Bimson, Peter James and David Rohl. Now on what grounds was this synchronism rejected? Well, primarily it was because of the squeeze of dynasties problem I referred to earlier that led to the rejection of this synchronism. In the case of Peter James and John Bimson, there was an initial effort to have the Libyan and Ethiopian dynasties run parallel with the 19th and 20th dynasties in the 1970s. That was referred to as the Glasgow Chronology. Now, when they felt that this parallel rule couldn't hold up to the evidence, they also rejected, out of necessity, quote unquote, the idea that the mid-18th dynasty could be placed as late as 923 BC. And therefore, no matter how amazing Velikovsky's Shishak synchronism with Thutmose III looked just on its own, it just could not be true. Now, John Bimson wrote an article that critiqued Velikovsky's Thutmose III Shishak identification. The key point was one that Velikovsky actually addressed in Ages and Chaos. Bimson wrote, "However, I also encountered problems with his identification of Thutmose III as the biblical Shishak. When examining the Karnak relief that Velikovsky interpreted as showing booty from the Solomon's temple, I noted, many of the objects are pure Egyptian in style and ornamentation. For example, the common occurrence of the uraeus, numbers 15, 58, 59, 60, 68, 77. Several Egyptian-style human figures, numbers 35, 69, 91, 173, 174, and the use of the cartouche as a decorative motif, numbers 11, 149, 172, 183. In one case, specifically the cartouche of Thutmose III. In short, the most natural interpretation of the relief is that the items are of an Egyptian manufacture, designed from the start for the temple of Amun at Karnak, and not booty from a campaign. I know of nothing in the text accompanying the scene that suggests that they were booty, and if they were, we would expect this to be clearly stated, since it would be to the Pharaoh's glory." Now recall that Velikovsky stated a few animal heads, lions with the sign of the uraeus on their foreheads, and the head of a hawk are wrought on the lids of the cups. These might have been brought from the palace Solomon had built for his Egyptian wife. Now, John Bimson's case against this synchronism appears to be a straw man argument. In addition, it is possible that the vast amount of what Thutmose III offers to Amun is a composite of mostly booty from the temple in Jerusalem and supplemented by some locally made objects, as noted by Bimson. Now, there is far more that supports Velikovsky's case than there is against it, based solely on the evidence on the treasure wall at Karnak. Now, Alan Montgomery notes a couple of other interesting supporting proofs in his article, The Queen of Sheba, Velikovsky versus Bimson. He writes, Thutmose III inscribed his campaigns on the walls of a temple at Karnak. He explained that the Asiatics had fallen into disagreement, which might refer to the rebellion of King Jeroboam, splitting Israel into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. According to the Septuagint, when Jeroboam had fled to Egypt, Shishak had given him an Egyptian princess named Arno for a wife. Now, Princess Arno's name appears on an 18th dynasty visceral jar. The jar stylistically is dated to the late 15th century, several decades after the death of Thutmose III. No other Princess Arno is known from Egyptian history. Now, one surprising supporting proof of Velikovsky's candidate of Thutmose III was found at Ras Sharma on the northern Syrian coast. In Ages and Chaos, Velikovsky writes, "Since the tablets of Ras Sharma belong to the period of the Amenhoteps and the Thutmoses, that's the 18th dynasty, not the 22nd, we should expect to find in them the biblical name of Shishak. He was, in fact, among the first of the deciphered words, and it caused considerable surprise." And he quotes a source that says, "The word SYSK seems a proper name, perhaps to bring together the Egyptian Sosek, Hebrew Sosek, and Sisak." The translator did not dare draw the correct conclusion, for what was this pharaoh of the 9th or 10th century doing in the middle of the second millennium? End of quote. Now, 1 Chronicles 22 verse 14 states that David prepared 100,000 talents of gold for the temple. Now, there are 30 kilos in a talent, so 100,000 talents is over 3,000 tons of gold, which is almost as much gold as is reported to be in Fort Knox. Now, if Rameses the Great, well known for his boasting, had plundered the temple of God as believed by David Rohl and took back that phenomenal amount of gold, would there not be a great boast showing all the treasures of the temple on some temple wall, as like with Thutmose III's at the temple of Karnak? And ditto for Peter James's Shishak candidate Rameses III in his temple at Medina Tabu. Now, the lack of such a booty record by those two Ramses is very telling in determining just who the real biblical Shishak was. Now, David Rohl has been able to provide evidence showing Rameses the Great invaded Jerusalem, but this one inscription pales in comparison to the number of exact and close matches on the Thutmose III relief and the biblical account of the temple treasures plundered that Velikovsky cites supporting Thutmose III of the mid-18th dynasty being the Shishak of the Bible. Both David Rohl and Peter James placed the 18th dynasty during the time of the Judges. The lack of any record of Egypt in the Bible during the Judges, given so many other different nations are noted in the book, strongly argues against both their candidates as well. Now, the late Bronze Age is normally dated to around 1200 BC. Now, as a result of that dating, the reign of Solomon is believed to have been in the Iron Age II period. Now, the archaeological remains from the Iron Age II period show a level of poverty in the land of Israel at this particular time, and so little is seen in archaeology to support Solomon's reign as some great era of prosperity in Israel. But by redating the late Bronze Age to a later time, including the time of Solomon, much better archaeological evidence is able to be matched up with the Bible's view of Solomon's reign being one of great prosperity. Now, one example of this is found at Megiddo, which David Rohl points out in a series of lectures that he gave that are available at the Patterns of Evidence website. Now, there is a large late Bronze Age palace found at Stratum 8 at Megiddo. Now, the conventional chronology assigns this to Akhenaten, and it's given a date of 1300 BC, which would place it in the time of the Judges or before to the time of the Canaanites, depending on which date one uses for the Exodus. Now, both David Rohl and Velikovsky's chronology would place this palace around 950 BC in the time of King Solomon. Now, where this late Bronze Age palace is, there is this beautifully worked city gate with cut or Ashkelon stones. Now, when you read how this palace in Jerusalem was built in 1 Kings 7, it says that there were 3 courses of cut or dressed stone, and in between these was a course of cedar beams to assist with preventing destruction by earthquakes. Now, this is exactly the same pattern of stonework that we see at this gate here in Megiddo. Now, there is one thing found at the excavations at Megiddo that is out of place in David Rohl's chronology if we assume that this Stratum 8 palace was the Palace of Solomon. David Rohl would place the time of Solomon when this palace was built during the reign of Seti the Great of the 19th dynasty. Now, Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, who included Megiddo in his list of conquered cities, ruled before the palace was built, according to David Rohl. Yet a seal of Thutmose III was found at a higher level than the palace, which would imply that Thutmose III ruled after, not before King Solomon. Now, the standard line from Egyptologists when they find such seals or scarabs that are out of place is that they were handed down as heirlooms and found in later levels. Now, while this later deposition may be valid at times, more often such seals are deposited at the same time as other artifacts of the same king. Now, the seal of Thutmose III found in Stratum 7b is exactly where it should be if Thutmose III is the biblical Shishak, as his Karnak treasure wall strongly supports. Now, inside this palace we've found a hoard of treasures which are usually attributed to being Canaanite, not Israelite. Now, in A Test of Time, David Rohl states, this magnificent hoard included gold vessels, jewellery of different styles, including gold and lapis lazuli beads, and a collection of ivory plaques. Now, one such ivory plaque has particularly piqued David Rohl's interest. Now, he notes that you can see on this ivory the Queen offering an Egyptian lotus flower, an Egyptian-style lion sphinx on his throne, and a winged sun disk above the chariot. Now, these items are not out of place since Solomon married an Egyptian princess and fell into idolatry late in his reign. Now, we also see here doves, which are a symbol of peace, which Solomon's name means, being a variation of shalom. Now, might this king here on his throne actually be King Solomon seated on his throne? Well, I think there's a very good chance that it actually could be. Now, in 1 Kings 9 verse 15, it mentions how Solomon built at Hyksos, Megiddo and Gezer. Now, at each of these sites there are these 6-chambered gates with cut ashlar stone. Now, the similarity of design suggests a central government that stretched from the north to the south of Israel. Now, on a documentary called The Bible's Buried Secrets, they interviewed Eilat Mazar, who has been excavating at the City of David Archaeological Park that has become a major tourist attraction at the top of the southeast spur to the south of the Dome of the Rock. Now, her team uncovered walls 3 to 5 metres thick and at least 30 metres long and several stories high near the entrance to the City of David tourist attraction. Now, this represents a huge building in this location, and she believes it to be the Royal Palace. Now, pottery and radiocarbon dating of organic remains points to a date somewhere within the range of King David and Ahab. Now, Kathleen Kenyon in 1961, following her time at Jericho, excavated the eastern slopes of the City of David. Now, she had found a vast stone terracing system which stretched along the eastern scarp of the old city. Now, it has been estimated that this extension of the city summit added at least 6,000 square metres to the occupational area of early Jerusalem. She initially believed it to be Solomon's Millo, until pottery was found that was contemporary with the time of Amenhotep III to the end of the 18th dynasty. Now, Amenhotep III is believed to have reigned 400 years before Solomon. Now, VELIKOVSKY'S chronology places Amenhotep III after Solomon, and David Rohl has Horemheb, who he places at the end of the 18th dynasty as Solomon's contemporary. Now, Egyptian hegemony was again in place over Judah sometime during the reign of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten. Now, we know this from the contents of the AMARNA letters, which includes letters between rulers in the land of Israel and Syria and their Egyptian overlord, the Pharaoh. Now, just when in Israel's history was this time of hegemony seen in the AMARNA letters? Now David Rohl places them in the time of Saul and David. Velikovsky placed them in the time of Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Another view is that they should be placed in the reigns of Ahab's son Joram and Jehoshaphat's bad son Jehoram. Now, before we look at the AMARNA letters, this would be a good place to briefly explain the chronology of my late friend from Newcastle, Dale Murphy. Now, he supported Velikovsky's synchronisms of Thutmose III with Shishak and Rameses II of the 19th dynasty with the biblical Necho who battled Nebuchadnezzar. Now, unlike Velikovsky, he supports the conventional view that the 18th and 19th dynasties were connected and not separated by 150 years, as Velikovsky argued. Now, to support both of Velikovsky's synchronisms and not separate dynasties 18 and 19, he extends dynasty 18 with extra lesser kings soon after ZERAH's defeat by Asa at the end of the reign of Amenhotep II. Now, Dale argues that the defeat of ZERAH and the million-man army caused a major collapse of the power of Egypt, allowing the Libyans to assert themselves in Egypt. Now, he sees an additional 6 pharaohs in one of the Manetho kings lists, which are normally interpreted as alternate names for the 18th dynasty kings. Now, these 6 extra kings extend the 18th dynasty as vassals of the Libyan 22nd dynasty in Dale's scheme. Now, according to Dale, Thutmose IV reasserts primary rule over the Libyans, who then go back to being secondary rulers a century later. Now, Thutmose IV's Sphinx stealer shows he wasn't the son of Amenhotep II, but a later 18th dynasty king trying to assert his legitimacy as king, according to Dale. Now, Dale's chronology basically stands or falls on the correct placement of the period of the AMARNA letters, as it actually follows Thutmose IV reasserting primary rule in Dale's chronology. Now, we have tentatively placed the 18th dynasty as contemporary with Saul through to the middle of the divided kingdom period, based on the identification of Thutmose III with the biblical Shishak. Now, we have a tremendous volume of information written in the AMARNA letters, which were written during the late 18th dynasty. Now, let's now look at what we can glean from them to lock in a place in the Bible's history that matches the information in the AMARNA letters, which we know were written during the late 18th dynasty. Now, the state archives of Akhenaten's capital, Akhet-Aten, today known as Amarna, were discovered in the late 19th century. Now, these AMARNA letters give us an amazing glimpse of the politics of the Middle East at the time of Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, and his father Amenhotep III. Now, Velikovsky writes the following regarding the AMARNA letters. Only a few tablets contain fragments of epic poems. All the others are letters exchanged between 2 successive kings of Egypt and their correspondents, the free kings of territories in the Middle East and Cyprus, and various vassal kings and princes or officers in Syria and Palestine. The kings of the north were not subject to the kings of Egypt, and they wrote to my brother, and they signed themselves thy brother. The kings in Canaan and Syria, however, were under the scepter of the Nile dynasty, and wrote to my king, my lord, and signed themselves thy servant. In the tablets written by the vassal king of Jerusalem to the Pharaoh, repeated mention is made of the Habaru, who threatened the land from the east of the Jordan. In letters written from other places, there is no reference to Habaru, but an invasion of Sargamesh. Sargaz is also read ideographically Hahatu and translated as cutthroats, pillagers. It is mentioned over and over again. In letters from Syria, the approach of the king of Hattai to the slopes of the mountains of Lebanon was reported with terror. The impression received is that these invasions of Habaru from the east and of the king of Hattai from the north menaced Egyptian domination of Syria, a domination which was learned actually ceased shortly after the reign of Akhenaten. In their letters, the vassals incessantly asked for help against the invaders and often also against one another. The name King of Hattai is generally understood as the King of the Hittites. In a later period, that of Seti I and Rameses II of the 19th dynasty, there were great wars between the kings of Hattai and the pharaohs. Now, Velikovsky identifies three key cities of the Alamanna letters as the following: Jerusalem as Jerusalem, capital of the southern kingdom of Judah; Sumer as Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel; and Gubla as Jezreel, secondary capital after Samaria. Now, most revisionist chronologists are in agreement with Velikovsky about Jerusalem being Jerusalem. Now, conventional chronology has a problem with this, as the time of the Alamanna letters is believed to be around the 1300s BC, contemporary with the time of the early judges, when Jerusalem was still held by the Jebusites and referred to as Jebus. Now, conventional chronology identifies Sumer as Samira on the Syrian coast just north of Lebanon, and identifies Gubla as Byblos a little to the south of Samira on the northern coast of Lebanon. Now, revisionist chronologists are split on the identifications of Sumer and Gubla. Now, some support Velikovsky's identification of them as Samaria and Jezreel, while others expose certain problems with these identifications and prefer the conventional identifications of them as Samira and Byblos. Now, I cover the pros and cons in my book, and I think that there is just a little bit more against Velikovsky's identifications as there is for them, though I firmly believe that Jerusalem is definitely Jerusalem. Now, here are the differing views of the dates assigned to the Alamanna period by different revised chronologies, as compared with the background of what was happening in the land of Israel at the time. Now, Velikovsky, who places the Alamanna period around the 850s BC, identified Jehoshaphat as Abdi-Heber, the king of Jerusalem. Now, Peter James, in an article he wrote in 1978 entitled "The Dating of the Alamanna Letters," argued the case that the evidence of the Alamanna letters makes a better case for Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, being Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem. Now, this view is still currently believed by Alan Montgomery, though Peter James rejected it when he later rejected Velikovsky's placement of the 18th dynasty. Now, Peter James currently places the Alamanna period during the time of the late 1100s BC, when Samuel's predecessor, Eli, judged Israel. Now, placing the Alamanna period in the 1100s does not appear to work if Jerusalem is indeed Jerusalem, because the Jebusites controlled Jerusalem, which was known as Jebus at the time. The Jebusite king would not have referred himself as the king of Jerusalem if he called the city Jebus. Now, David Rohl places the Alamanna period in the time of Saul and David, that is the late 1000s BC, believing Labayu, the chief figure from the hill country of Palestine, north of Jerusalem, is King Saul, and that the Habaru, or Upperu, of the Alamanna letters is David and his army, seeing Habaru as the same as Hebrew. Now, Rohl contends that Abdi-Heber, the king of Jerusalem, is the last Jebusite king of Jebus before David conquered it. Now, I find it highly unlikely that the last king of Jebus would call his city Jerusalem in his letters instead of Jebus. Now, Eric Atchison dates the time of the Alamanna letters to around the 700s BC and proposes that Hezekiah was Abdi-Heber, the king of Jerusalem. Dale Murphy places the Alamanna period slightly earlier than Eric does and believes that Hezekiah's father Ahaz was Abdi-Heber. Now, does the Alamanna period fit the time of the judges as currently claimed by Peter James? Well, what is clear in the Alamanna letters is that Egypt has hegemony over both Syria and Palestine at the time. Now, when we compare this with the Bible, there is no direct evidence in the Bible that the Egyptians had hegemony over Israel during this time. After the Exodus, the Bible is silent about Egypt until we get to the time of Solomon, when he made an alliance with Egypt. Now, lots of other neighbouring nations are referred to in the time of the Judges, who often oppressed Israel during that time, but not a single mention of Egypt. And as I just noted, Jerusalem is still controlled by the Jebusites and called Jebus at this time, not Jerusalem. Now, what about David ROHL'S claim that the Elemental letters were written in the time of Saul and David? Now, David ROHL claims that Saul is Labaya, and that the Hebrew of the Elemental letters is David and his army, and that Dadua in one letter is a reference to David, and Ahab is Joab. Now, in an online article entitled Pharaohs in the Bible, David ROHL'S Chronology Untenable, the following points are made against David's placement of the Elemental letters contemporary with Saul and David. This author writes, Labayu was the governor of Shechem, whereas Saul lived in the vicinity of Gibeon. Labayu was killed by citizens of Gina. Saul committed suicide after being defeated by the Philistines at the foot of the Gilboa Mountains. 3 of his 4 sons died in the same battle. Several letters dating from after Labayu's death speak about his 2 sons who collaborated with the Hebrew and gave them pieces of land. The Elemental letters don't mention the Philistines, whereas Saul had to fight the Philistines throughout his reign. Now, Eric Atchison also writes, David and his army were confined to the south and went north to take over the kingdom. The Aparu came from the north and took over many of the cities, none of which David or Saul controlled. Now, Alan Montgomery makes the following comments about David ROHL'S placement of the Amarna period in the time of Saul and David. Alan writes, ROHL'S placement of the Elemental letters in the days of Saul and David is unconvincing. The conflict in Saul's time was Israel versus Philistia. The whole tenure of the Amarna period is intrigue of several mischievous states, mainly Damascus, vying for power under the nose of a stronger Egyptian overlord. The main threat to the overlordship of Egyptian territories is the Hittites. The biblical texts do not mention Egypt or Damascus as major players in the time of David and Saul, nor is there any mention of a Hittite superpower in the time of Saul, although there is mention of Uriah the Hittite in the acting of David's day. It is a mismatch of Elemental letters to place them in the reign of Saul. David's foes after the Philistines were the Arameans or Syrians. They did not create havoc for him. He handled them very well. The Arameans did not harass their neighbours like the Syrians constantly do in the Elemental letters. They had little money left after they had paid tribute to the Israelites. It is a mismatch to place the Amarna letters in the context of David's reign. The mismatch continues into the next dynasty as Seti I invades Bethshan and sets up a stela in Bethshan in the northern area of Israel, in the middle of Israel's most powerful time during the reign of Solomon. While Solomon has everyone building the temple in his palace, an Egyptian army supposedly invades and establishes a military post in the middle of Israel, which is still there in the days of Rameses II. And what is the response of King Solomon, the richest and most powerful king of the world at that time, to this insufferable arrogance? We are expected then to believe that Solomon gave neither diplomatic nor military response to this. This is incredible. It never happened. Now, Eric Atchison and Dale Murphy argue for the dating of the Elemental letters to be a century later than VELIKOVSKY, and they have the era of the Amarna period in the 8th century BC, that is the late 700s, when the Assyrians were very active, threatening Palestine during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, who took away captive the Israelite tribes on the east bank of the Jordan. Now, Dale Murphy says that Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem, is Ahaz, Hezekiah's father. In EA 287, Abdi-Heber says that the Habaru are attempting to take Jerusalem. Now the Assyrians only attempted to take Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah, not in the reign of Ahaz, so Abdi-Heber does not appear to be Ahaz. Now Eric Atchison says that Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem, is Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah was a godly king. Now Abdi-Heber means servant of Heber, a Hittite goddess. Now a godly king like Hezekiah would not have addressed the Pharaoh also as my sun god, as Abdi-Heber did in EA 288. So equating Abdi-Heber with Hezekiah does not work either. Now both Eric and Dale identify the Assyrians as the Habaru. In EA 287, Abdi-Heber says that the Habaru are attempting to take Jerusalem. Now, as I mentioned before, the Assyrians only attempted to take Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah, not in the reign of Ahaz, and we know from EA 288 that Hezekiah was not Abdi-Heber, as Hezekiah would not have addressed the Pharaoh as my sun god, as Abdi-Heber did. Now also, the major antagonists in the AMARNA letters are the Syrian kings, who are rather quiet in the time of Hezekiah and his father Ahaz. Now these points appear to show that trying to fit the AMARNA period to the late 700s BC is a mismatch for what is happening at the time in the AMARNA letters. Now Peter James, in an article he wrote on the AMARNA letters in 1978, wrote, Velikovsky based his comparison of the events of the letters and those of the scriptures on the identifications of Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem with King Jehoshaphat of Judah, Rib-Abdi of Gubla and Suma with King Ahab of Israel, and Abdi-Ashurta and his son Azarub of Amaru with Ben-Hadad and Hazael, rulers of Damascus. With the latter two identifications, he seems to be on firmest ground, in that we have a succession of two rulers, both of whom are characterized in the letters and the scriptures as powerful rulers who made frequent army excursions and conquests in the territories to the south of their kingdom. Velikovsky claims that Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem, is to be equated with Jehoshaphat. Now Abdi-Heber means servant of Heber, Heber being the name of a Hittite goddess. Can one really believe that Jehoshaphat, whom the Old Testament praises for his loyalty to the Israelite God, could also have borne this name involving a Hittite goddess? Now Velikovsky did in fact prefer the earlier reading of the name Ebed Tov, good servant, a name without idolatrous connotations. The reading Ebed Tov is now universally rejected. Instead, we suggested that Abdi-Heber may have been Jehoram, denounced by the writers of the Kings and Chronicles as an idolater, and conceivably a worshipper of the Hurrian goddess Heba or Hepat. Now the raids by the Amaru in the AMARNA letters are a good match for the constant wars of the Syrian kings Ben-Hadad and Hazael in the Bible, though Abdi-Heber doesn't match Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was a godly king, and he would not have addressed the Pharaoh as my sun god in EA 288. Now, during the time that Peter James still supported Velikovsky's placement of the 18th dynasty, he wrote an excellent article called The Dating of the AMARNA Letters, and argued that the evidence of the AMARNA letters makes a better case for Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram being Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem. Now, I'd like to now quote more from that particular article. Now, Peter here writes, all the cities accused by Abdi-Heber of participation in the Habaru uprising are to the west or southwest of Judah, with the exception of Shechem in Israel. The idea proposed by Velikovsky, then, that Abdi-Heber's letters are describing an invasion from Transjordania, Ammon, Moab and Edom against Jehoshaphat, is quite untenable. It is clear from his letters that rebellions are occurring in and on the border with Philistia, and that the invaders of Abdi-Heber's territories are, in the main, the Philistine rebels. Philistia was quiet during the reign of Jehoshaphat, far from mentioning that the Philistines took common cause with the Moabite invaders. 2 Chronicles 17:11 records that some of the Philistines actually paid him tribute. Edom had been a tributary to Judah during the reign of Jehoshaphat, and had been ruled by his deputy. Jehoram led his territory into Edom in an attempt to crush the revolt, but suffered a serious defeat, and Edom remained independent of Judah unto this day. Moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram, that's Jehoshaphat's son, the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians. And they came up into Judah and broke into it and carried away all the substance that was found in the king's house. 2 Chronicles 21, verses 16 to 17. With the revolt of Edom and Philistia, the invasion of Judah, and the sack of his palace, Jehoram's kingdom must have been on the verge of total collapse. In one letter, EA 288, Abdi-Heber defines the extent of the revolts against his authority. He writes, "Let my king take thought for his land. The land of the king is lost. In its entirety it is taken from me. There is war against me, as far as the lands of Seir, and as far as Gath Carmel. All the governors are at peace, but there is war against me." Now Seir, a mountain to the south of the Dead Sea, was the ancestral home of the Edomites, and was used as a synonym for Edom by the prophets. The name Gath Carmel contains the element Gath, a familiar Philistine place name. The question of the Arabians that were near the Cushites has been a vexed one for biblical scholars. Eva Danielis and Martin Seif, in their discussions of the identity of the Queen of Sheba, have already drawn attention to the presence of Arabian colonies in Ethiopia, known from both literary and archaeological records. The solution of the problem of the Arabians that were near the Cushites is clear. They were simply conscripts of the Egyptian army from the Kassai lands that were on service in Palestine. We return to EA 287. With reference to the Nubians, the Kassai, "Let my king ask commissioners whether my house is not very strong. Yet they attempted a very great crime. They took the implements and breached off the roof. If they send into the land of Jerusalem troops, let them come up with an Egyptian officer for regular service. Let my king take heed for them, for all the lands are impoverished by them. And let my king requisition from them much grain, much oil, and much clothing. The men of the land of Nubia have committed an evil deed against me. I was almost killed by the men of the land of Nubia in my own house. Let the king call them to account. 7 times, and 7 times let the king my lord avenge me." Their sack of Abdi-Heber's palace was evidently part of a concerted plan of the Philistines timed to coincide with their own invasion of Judah. And if VELIKOVSKY'S reading of Beth Shulman is correct, Philistines from Keilah entered Jerusalem and occupied the Temple Mount. To sum up, the disasters that befell Jehoram of Judah and Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem were identical. Both suffered revolts of their subject territories from Philistia to Edom. During the reigns of both, the Philistines attacked and swept right across Judah, entering Jerusalem itself, in concert with the sack of the king's palace by the men of the land of Kassai, or men that were near the Cushites. These peculiar circumstances could hardly be duplicated in such detail after a period of 500 years. It is clear that VELIKOVSKY'S general placement of the AMARNA letters in the mid-9th century must be correct, and that the modification of his original model suggested here that Abdi-Heber was Jehoram rather than Jehoshaphat is preferable. Now I should note that there is no evidence of Cushites sacking Jerusalem in the time of the Judges, where Peter James now places the AMARNA letters, nor is there any evidence of Cushites sacking Jerusalem in the time of Saul and David. Now, given the best evidence for the biblical Shishak appears to support Thutmose III being a contemporary of Rehoboam, it is not surprising, after comparing and contrasting the different time periods suggested for the AMARNA letters, that the best evidence appears to support Akhenaten being a contemporary of Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram. The disasters that befell Jehoram of Judah and Abdi-Heber of Jerusalem were identical. Both suffered revolts of their subject territories from Philistia to Edom in concert with the sack of the king's palace by the men of the land of Kassai, or men that were near the Cushites. Now, archaeologists in excavating sites across Greece and western Turkey believe that there was a dark age of some 400 to 500 years following the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. Mycenaean pottery is assigned to date several hundred years before the next Greek civilization, due to its synchronism to the time of Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty, as there was a tremendous amount of Mycenaean pottery found at its capital AMARNA in Egypt. I'd like to now quote some extracts from an excellent article called Greek Pottery, Dark Ages and Egyptian Chronology by Alan Montgomery that explains this Dark Age gap in Greek archaeology. Alan writes, in the 19th century, archaeologists were at the cutting edge of a new discipline, archaeology. The public's interest in the heroic tales of the Mycenaean warriors such as Achilles and the decade-long Trojan War between the Greek city-states and Troy, recorded in Homer's Iliad, has been heightened by the daring excavations of an amateur archaeologist named Schliemann. Mycenaean pottery was the pottery that belonged to the Trojan War. Dating of the Mycenaean pottery was problematic as no reliable Greek dates existed earlier than the 7th century BC. Greek archaeologists noticed that the Iron Age pottery of the 8th and 7th century was influenced by Mycenaean pottery. Dates were estimated according to the time needed for the new pottery styles to evolve from the old. Then in 1890, a major discovery changed everything. Sir Flinders Petrie discovered Mycenaean pottery at a place called AMARNA. In ancient times it was called Akhenaten and had been the capital city built by Pharaoh Akhenaten. Petrie's excavation revealed that the Egyptian pharaohs had imported Mycenaean pottery. Unlike Greece, Egypt had an absolute chronology that went back 3,000 years before Christ. These absolute dates could now be applied to Mycenaean pottery, replacing the estimated Greek archaeological dates. Archaeology relies heavily on pottery for dating. Creating a new system of dates for pottery is a major event for archaeologists. So when Petrie insisted on solving the chronological problems of the Greek archaeologists, it was taken very seriously. However, it was a gift that the Greek archaeologists were neither expecting nor wanted. Tor, a Greek archaeologist, pointed out that when Petrie applied his dates to Mycenaean pottery, it created a huge 500-year archaeological gap. Formerly, the dates of the Mycenaean period, circa 1000 to 700 BC, allowed continuity with and even overlap of the geometric period. Petrie's dates pushed back the Mycenaean era to 1450 to 1200 BC, but without providing history or material culture to fill the empty gap. This empty gap became known as the Greek Dark Age. The Greek Dark Age was not like the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire, during which only a little of the history and material culture is known. The Greek Dark Age lacks any history or material culture at all. Furthermore, the culture of the 7th century Archaic period is clearly derived from the Mycenaean age. Troy Level 7 contained late Helladic 3A Mycenaean pottery of the 14th century according to Petrie's chronology. Level 7A lasted about 50 years, and the Mycenaean pottery gradually became late Helladic 3B, or 13th century. Also present was pottery known as grey minionware and tanware. Troy 7B was almost certainly destroyed by fire, circa 1100 to 1050 BC. Level 8 contained Greek geometric pottery dates to the 7th century without controversy. Thus, according to the ceramic connection of Mycenaean pottery with the 18th dynasty and Petrie's Egyptian dating, the site was abandoned for 400 years, 1050 to 650 BC, between level 7B and level 8. Now, as you can see in the chart on the right, the fire destruction level is dated 400 years before the next level, level 8. A similar conclusion was forced by the grey minionware found on level 6, 7A and 7B. It was still being produced in the following level 8, and Blegan had to suppose a 400-year gap in the middle of the grey minionware also. He wrote, "In the 7th century BC, the Trojan citadel, which had been virtually deserted for some 4 centuries, suddenly blossomed into life once more with occupants who were still able to make grey minion pottery." According to Blegan, the people who produced this ware must have lived somewhere else and returned 400 years later. Now, this is a very strained explanation, to say the least. Worse still, the late geometric pottery of the 7th century is actually found on level 7 with the 11th century Mycenaean Late Helladic 3C pottery. Now, note in the chart on the right, grey minionware is found both before and after the supposed 400-year hiatus, and the Greek geometric pottery of the 7th century BC is found before the destruction level, which is before the supposed 400-year hiatus. Now, Blegan reported that the geometric shards found on level 7 seem to be of exactly the same kind as the late geometric pottery from the archaic 7th century strata. House number 814 was a late Bronze Age building from level 7B, dated to the 12th century, under which pottery from the 8th century was later found. Blegan's results show levels 7 and 8 are continuous. The rational application of archaeological principles would demand a date from the late 9th to the early 7th century for levels 7A and 7B to fit the 7th century date of the succeeding level 8. If the fall of Troy and level 7B were dated near 800 BC rather than Blegan's 1260 BC, then this would close the chronological gap of 460 years. In Greek history, this solves the important problem of the Dark Ages. They never existed. Now, just as an aside, John Crow has recently written a book called The Troy Deception, in which he advocates that the site of Hyssos, commonly assumed to be Troy, does not fit the ancient evidence in the Iliad. Now, he advocates the lower city of Bergama, below the Acropolis of Pergamos, as the site for Troy. Now, Pergamos is well known as the site of one of the 7 churches of Revelation. The altar of its temple of Zeus was excavated by German archaeologists and reconstructed where it is today, in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. Now, continuing on with Alan's article on the Greek Dark Ages, he writes, "This brings us to the gateway at Mycenae. The gateway at Mycenae had 2 standing columns facing each other with a column in between. Figure 1 contains pictures of the 2 gateways. Lions are a common motif in the ancient world. Now, because of the similarity of Mycenaean design to that of 8th century Gordian, late 19th century art historians originally assigned the Mycenaean gateway to the 8th century BC. Petrie's Egyptian chronology had the effect of redating the Mycenaean gate to 500 years earlier. Tor would have disagreed and argued that the similarity between the 2 gateways meant one had been copied and therefore could not have been separated by 500 years. The impact of the Egyptian dating of Mycenaean pottery was not restricted to Greece, because the Greeks traded their pottery all over the Mediterranean. Everywhere their pottery is found, the stratum containing it became identified with the Mycenaean era and was thus dated. Thus, the Greek Dark Ages spread into many places in the Mediterranean. In Italy, the 8th century Villanovan Iron Age pottery succeeded the late Apennine with its late Mycenaean, a gap of over 300 years. In Sicily, the Pantolican culture of the late 8th century succeeded the Thapsos with its 13th century Mycenaean pottery, a 500-year gap. In all these places, huge chronological gaps appeared between the cultures that traded with the Mycenaeans and the Greek colonists of the 8th, 7th centuries. The evidence that has been examined demonstrates consistently that there is always a 400 or 500 year gap. It is always at the late Bronze Iron Age boundary and always with similar artifacts on both sides of the gap. To continue to say the Egyptian chronology is right is to say that both Greek archaeological dates and the Assyrian dates, while agreeing, are both 500 years off. Furthermore, in the first millennium BC, biblical dates agree to Assyrian dates within 50 years. Thus, three different chronological systems agree with each other and disagree with a fourth system. Rationality demands the acceptance of the three and the rejection of the fourth. Furthermore, VELIKOVSKY'S placement puts the 18th dynasty exactly where Tor and the Greek archaeologists claimed it was, in the 10th and 9th centuries. VELIKOVSKY and Tor arrived at the same result, but through different methodologies. Now, the Greek Dark Age is consistently found to be around 450 to 500 years between the years 1200 BC and 750 BC. Now, Peter James dates the end of Dynasty 19 and the end of the Late Bronze Age to 950 BC. So when this reduction is applied, this revised date still leaves a 200-year gap in the archaeology of Greece. Now, David Rohl dates the end of Dynasty 19 and the end of the Late Bronze Age a century later to 850 BC. Now, his revised date still leaves a 100-year gap in the archaeology of Greece. Immanuel VELIKOVSKY dates the end of the Late Bronze Age to 750 BC. And this 750 BC date completely closes the Dark Age gap. Now, in Lecture 6, we will further investigate the Dark Age gap and look at the evidence for it in Turkey and Syria, where we will see consistent dating gaps around 600 to 650 years due to a synchronism of a Hittite treaty with Dynasty 19 Pharaoh Rameses the Great. Now, David Rohl reduces the dating of Dynasty 19 by 350 years. These dating gaps are nearly twice that reduction he proposes. The difference in the dating gaps seen in Greece, around 480 years on average, compared to those in Turkey, around 630 years on average, we will see is highly significant. Now, we've seen good evidence supporting the placement of the 18th dynasty from the time of King Saul of Israel through to about 820 BC by virtue of two major synchronisms. In our next lectures, we will see whether there is sufficient cause to keep or reject this placement of the 18th dynasty as we look at the burning question that divides those who call for a revision of Egypt's conventional chronology. Was there a gap of some 150 years or not between dynasties 18